Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak at EarthCorps Global Learning Summit. And thanks for taking the time to learn a bit about community-centric fundraising. My name is Andrea Arenas. I use she, her pronouns, and I live and work in Seattle, Washington. I'm a nonprofit and philanthropy consultant focused on equitable fundraising and grant making approaches. And before becoming a consultant, I worked for a philanthropic foundation where I led prospective grantee outreach in the Puget Sound. And before that, I was the director of development at the Seattle Parks Foundation, where I led individual, corporate, and institutional giving for the organization and supported fiscally sponsored groups with their fundraising goals and capacity. I'm also one of the 10 founding members of Community-Centric Fundraising. So today I'm going to provide a brief overview of community-centric fundraising, which I'll abbreviate as CCF, including why it was created, how it was created, and we'll begin to unpack the 10 principles of CCF to see how they've been applied to donor cultivation efforts. I'll also share some examples from organizations that have actualized the principles to shift their fundraising to be more equitable. And at the end, I'll share some resources so you can continue your CCF journey after this session. So I always like to start out with some visioning. So let's consider what if. What if the work of nonprofits were not viewed as individual, but as part of a larger constellation representing community and social justice? And in that constellation, all funding was unrestricted, and we didn't have to exaggerate how low our overhead is. What if the sector could see our clients not just as recipients of our nonprofit services, but as vital contributors to the community? What if all nonprofit staff were compensated fairly, with respect and appreciation, and received a thriving wage? What if we worked as hard as we do towards donors to retain and appreciate staff, volunteers, board members, clients, and neighbors? And what if rather than creating a sense of charity among donors towards other community members, we instead recognized that everyone personally benefits from engaging in the work of nonprofits and social justice? So, in order to reimagine or improve systems, we need to examine how both nonprofit and philanthropic systems came to be. And the reality is, philanthropic foundations are primarily funded through extractive practices. When we think about our country's oldest and largest philanthropic foundations, many accumulated wealth from owning land for farming, real estate, or extracting natural resources. They controlled banks and led industrial endeavors such as railroad and automobile manufacturing. And that wealth accumulation in our country has a violent history of colonization, indigenous genocide, land theft, and stolen labor from the enslavement of African people. And as we can see, that wealth accumulation continues to this day through the exploitation of land and labor, specifically at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and people of color's health and vitality. And in alignment with that, the nonprofit's default fundraising philosophy and practices have focused on the comfort of donors who are mostly white. And this traditional way of fundraising is called donor-centric fundraising. And while this approach has proven effective in raising money, it has in many ways been perpetuating the very injustice the nonprofit sector has been trying to end. Um, this is because current practices prevent important conversations about race, inequity, and privilege. It reinforces in donors the unconscious perception that the people that we help are merely objects of pity and charity. And these practices have been driving out fundraisers of color while furthering the fact that less than 10% of philanthropic dollars go to Black, Indigenous, and people of color led organizations and movements. In 2021, Giving USA identified that in the United States alone, philanthropy is a $484 billion industry, of which 67% comes from individual donors. we see that the practices, theories, and framework of modern philanthropy and fundraising often ignore the ways in which the sector perpetuates harm. And I want to pause here for a second to point out that this 484 billion is only illustrating giving that can be tracked by the IRS, um, such as through foundations to nonprofits and through donor advised funds. It doesn't take into account less trackable generosity, like money given to a lemonade stand or the funds neighbors pull together for a family in need. And it also doesn't include GoFundMe, which has raised over $9 billion dollars in total as of 2020. Um, so I think it's always just interesting to recognize and to identify when reports like this come out, what are they talking about? And in this case, it is talking about things that the IRS can see. So going back to fundraising, um, when I first became a fundraiser, I wasn't able to articulate all of this, but there was a feeling that something was off. I was taught to cater to donors and bend over backwards to please them, despite it conflicting with the external values and vision of the nonprofit's mission. So let's move on to the creation of CCF. In 2017, a group of 10 Seattle fundraisers of color, myself included, started meeting regularly. This group included Vu Le, author of the nonprofit AF blog, who had just begun writing about the harm that donor-centric fundraising perpetuates, and Michelle Murray, who led the fundraising campaign for Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth. And our group quickly realized that we shared feelings of disappointment and frustration with quote unquote best practices and began dreaming what more equitable fundraising could look like. In 2018, we invited Seattle area fundraisers of color to gather with us, and 90 people showed up, representing CEOs to emerging fundraising professionals. For many of us, it was our first time meeting one another. We hadn't convened in a place like that before. And from the convening, three key pillars emerged from our discussions. And it was one, fundraisers of color were craving community. They didn't feel a sense of belonging in historically white led fundraising associations, and many felt isolated in their jobs. Some were considering leaving the sector, unhappy with traditional fundraising approaches, and this lack of having a values aligned professional community. Two, people wanted to shift to more equitable practices in their day to day fundraising efforts. Fundraisers cited tokenism, exploiting stories, and being subjected to racist and sexist donor behavior. People wanted to learn to fundraise in ways that honored the community and methods that didn't lead to burnout and harm. And number three, the group recognized that advocacy and collaboration was needed with philanthropy colleagues to create more equitable grant making practices. Ultimately, less hoops to jump through to secure funding, and more trust that nonprofits can do their work efficiently and effectively. So in 2019, we distributed a survey that received over 2,000 responses. And we learned that the majority of fundraisers surveyed are unhappy with the field. Folks felt like traditional fundraising practices were harmful in the work towards justice, and that there wasn't enough discussion about the intersection of social justice and fundraising. So, with this data, we launched the community centric fundraising movement in 2020 to share the 10 principles of CCF and to work in community to actualize them. Since then, there's over 85 regional chapters of CCF. We've grown an active online community with over 7,000 users. Um, there's about 15,000 active subscribers to our mailing list, which shares weekly articles written by CCF fundraisers. And in recognition of the founding council's limited geographic perspective, with all of us being in the Seattle area, over the past year, we welcomed a global council to oversee future activities. And that global council includes people representing various US cities, Canada, Mexico, Guatemala, South Africa, and Kenya. So that's the background on why and how CCF got started. And next, we'll dig into the 10 principles. Uh, the 10 principles are how we aspire to transform fundraising and philanthropy so that they're co grounded in racial and economic justice. We believe that CCF is not a one size fits all approach and that the principles will likely look different in practice at different organizations, depending on variables such as budget size, staff capacity, unique community considerations, focus area of the mission, and honestly, where the organization may be and how openly they discuss equity and embrace challenging conversations. So, as we go through each principle, I want to emphasize that there's a spectrum of ways to actualize these principles. Later on, I'll offer some examples and scenarios from other nonprofits. But for now, let's go one by one through each principle. Principle one, fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. Um, I'll also add that all these principles are on our website, and I'll make sure that you have that link at the end of the session. So, principle number one, while many of us are already embracing uncomfortable conversations about equity with our boards, colleagues, even volunteers, donors have mainly been exempt. And similarly, we've seen program staff be much more involved in equity trainings and discussions as if it doesn't apply to fundraisers and donors. It's also typical to see program staff more closely represent the demographics of the community they serve than the fundraising team. So, principle number one, we really believe that social justice is a priority and reason for nonprofits to exist, and we want to see more of that incorporated into fundraising, fundraising teams, and all fundraising efforts. Principle two, individual organizational missions are not as important as the collective community. This goes back to the idea of a larger constellation. Scarcity mindset has put nonprofits in competition with one another, where the larger vision becomes cloudy. Um, I like to envision how multiple organizations overlap to impact one person. Let's imagine a person who may need housing assistance. Then, once she has shelter, she goes to another organization to gain workforce training. And now, with a steady job, she decides to have a family. She goes to a nonprofit health provider for maternal and infant health care. Her child is set up for success by going to another organization for early education support, and then is mentored and supported through an arts and culture after school program. So, this family benefited from a collective effort of resources, yet nonprofits themselves are often losing sight of that collective effort, especially when fundraising. Some organizations hoard their donors, afraid that if a donor knows about the great work of another organization, that they'll take their money elsewhere. And this ultimately underestimates the donor's ability to make their own decisions or perhaps to decide uh, to support multiple organizations. Principle three, nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. Um, Working in philanthropy, I met an organization focused on resources for transgender adults. And when I asked about trans youth, they said, yes, there's a huge need for funding to support trans youth. And that's not our focus. Our skill is connecting with adults. Youth isn't our expertise. But hey, this other organization over there is doing amazing work for trans youth. And I thought that was a pretty remarkable and kind of brave statement of them because I think so many would have thought that this would make them seem less desirable to a donor and that they demonstrated that they have gaps in their programming. But instead, they made this very deliberate decision to focus only on their strengths, not to mission drift, and also uplifted a partner organization. Um, So I think it's really important. What are the ways that we can support one another, either having very similar missions, and then what are ways that we can look at that larger constellation and collective community to say, hey, here's an organization that's doing something totally different than us, but it's also fulfilling a need in our community. Let's share each other's stories. Let's figure out how we can collaborate. Let's make sure donors know about the great work going on in this geographic region or within this demographic community. Um, it doesn't all have to be competition. Principle 4, all who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member. Um, I used to work at an organization where there were really dedicated volunteers. Those volunteers met with so many folks that came through the doors of that organization, had firsthand stories about their experiences that just added this credibility and I'd say like this wow factor to the organization that people have the opportunity to meet with these volunteers one on one. They got an annual pizza party, and meanwhile, board members and high wealth one time donors receive special recognition, their names on plaques in the building, and more. And there's gratitude practices that have been applied to donors, like ensuring immediate thank you calls and handwritten thank you notes, that are seldom applied to volunteers, other staff, or artists and vendors. In full transparency, we've heard that it can be hard to actualize this because it often requires action from more than just fundraising staff. It requires a mindset shift to collective community, and it can be hard to gather that support, especially if you have a large team, a large organization where there are so many other departments. So that's just something to keep in mind. I think there's numerous ways to recognize volunteers, staff, board members, neighbors of your organization in a way that we've been trained to do for donors, but we just haven't been doing. Principle 5, time is valued equally as money. Going back to the volunteers or the staff that stays late or board members that offer their expertise outside of board meetings, time is so valuable yet hardly valued. Uh, some nonprofits are doing away with required board giving requirements, acknowledging that this creates barriers for some to join boards, recognizing that monetary giving does not necessarily correlate to commitment. Gifts of time and expertise are appreciated and needed as much as gifts of money. I think in fundraising, it's easy for us to lose sight of the gifts of time and expertise because they don't have that monetary value. But as we know, nonprofit communities, we need all three to really thrive. Principle 6, we treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent and occasionally have difficult conversations. If we're going to talk about the root causes and systemic inequity, it's uncomfortable. But we shouldn't sugarcoat or infantilize donors when we're having challenging conversations with our colleagues, board, and clients. We must have honest, respectful conversations, including strong disagreements as needed with our donors. Um, this is one that has a lot of that perceived risk, and I think every organization needs to talk about this internally. At what point are we sugarcoating things? At what point are we infantilizing donors? When do we feel nervous to say words that are categorized as diversity, equity, and inclusion, like buzzwords or terminology? And why is that? Um, from what I've seen talking to organizations, it comes much more naturally for staff to talk about these things internally, with board members, with their volunteers, with clients. Um, but there is this hesitance of like, oh, we're going to go say the word white supremacy culture to a donor, and is that going to turn them off? Are they going to pull their funding from us? Like, let's not use that word. Let's talk about it this other way. Like, let's not attribute inequitable parks and public spaces to redlining and gentrification. Let's talk about it in a different way. And I challenge everyone to note when they're feeling that and to really analyze why. Why are we wanting to provide this right to comfort for donors in a way that we don't towards others, and that we're able to have much more transparent and um, progressive conversations with others. Principle 7, we foster a sense of belonging, not othering. So, othering is a common and effective donor messaging method. You've probably seen it before in advertisements or commercials that are like, you can save Timmy's life by donating $5. You can be his hero. You can save this person that you seemingly have nothing in common with and no connection to. Um, Give $5, be Timmy's hero. And this perpetuates the idea or feeling that charity is when someone gives to someone lesser. It really enforces this hierarchy, it enforces stereotypes and perpetuates divides. And that's the hard part when it comes to fundraising, because I understand why people want to be the hero. I understand why you want to feel good knowing what your money is going to, but it doesn't help with that collective community feeling. It doesn't help um, create commonality with neighbors that maybe you haven't met before. So I truly believe othering is really doing a disservice to all nonprofits. How can we reinforce that we're in it together? Everyone has value, everyone contributes to community. Some folks might be in different positions and just need a few more resources. Um, Other folks are privileged and have those resources. How do we find commonality and really come together? Principle 8, we promote the understanding that everyone personally benefits from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. This goes again back to collective community, and giving to local nonprofits puts good into their community. It redistributes wealth and power, provides equitable access, and that in turn enriches the neighborhood and benefits the donors. We want to encourage donors to recognize that constellation. Principle 9, we see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. We need to be honest about overhead costs. So many organizations skew their overhead to align with grant opportunities, but these parameters have been unrealistic and set problematic expectations. Um, we need to push back when donors and funders insist on this style of transactional giving. And again, while problematic, it has been effective to tell donors, hey, your $100 will cover the cost of, planting these trees. And I can say, oh, I like the idea that my $100 will directly support this effort. It's going to directly buy the trees that are needed to be put in the ground. And then, you know, part of this forest could not have happened without my help. I like to think that I can help another person or community and really be that hero. But if we all give that way, who's paying for the less sexy costs? Like custodial staff needed to clean a performing arts theater. Who's paying for the light bulbs and batteries of hospital staff and their supplies that are needed? Who's buying ink and printers to be able to print documentation on, hey, where are these trees going to be printed? What address am I going to today? Internet, phone, all sorts of things that we know we need for nonprofits to operate, to just be able to turn the lights on, to be able to come to your place of work each day and figure out what you need to do on the programmatic side. Who's paying for that? So, in this scenario of planting trees, we're either positioning nonprofits to only receive restricted revenue for the trees, or we're just not being transparent about what our overhead needs are. Um, we need people to see that there's a diverse mix of revenue that allows programs to go on. And we need to be transparent about it, because when we're transparent, it gives donors an opportunity to see and appreciate that many elements are needed to make things run. Principle 10, we recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. This involves fundraisers and donors grappling with and addressing the root causes of inequity, including the destructive effects of capitalism and how we may be complicit in the furthering them through our practices. I really want to emphasize the word grappling here. It's not that you need to declare something or have a organizational stance, but really having those internal discussions to grapple with this. What are the root causes and why this nonprofit is in existence? What are the root causes that have caused or impacted the community to have these sorts of inequities? If we're using the example of parks and public spaces, what went on in the past that now certain neighborhoods don't have the same amenities of parks and public spaces, um, the same sorts of access that other neighborhoods had? I think looking at that history to better understand it is really needed. It's needed in the way that we present our organizations. It's needed in the way that we explain why funding is needed to our donors. Um, I like to use an example with food banks, where there's some food banks that are, they're amazing and making sure that everyone has access to lunch or everyone gets a sandwich every day. And that is totally needed in our communities and neighborhoods. That is a symptom due to food insecurity. And we need someone to fill that gap. And on the other hand, what are we doing to ensure that food insecurity ends in our communities? Not all food banks have the capacity or resources or focus area of ending food insecurity. I think those are two very big differences of handing out sandwiches every day and then working to advocate and to change systems so that there isn't food insecurity. Um, and I like to bring those two things up just as examples where there's some organizations that do both and do it in an amazing way, and there's some that just do one or the other. So, what is needed in community today? What is needed in community in the future? And then what are the root causes of why that exists? And how do we just begin to reinvent and dismantle those systems to be more equitable and just going forward? So that was a quick overview of the principles. I also want to emphasize that CCF is not a certificate or membership. CCF is deliberately a movement. We want to support and encourage fundraisers to re-examine all the fundraising practices you've been taught, explore how to do fundraising in a way that doesn't perpetuate harm, and that furthers social justice. And movements begin with values, which is why we focused on the 10 principles. Movements require change, so we encourage fundraisers, nonprofit professionals, donors, and funders to take action, and movements are supported from the inside out. We can't just call for sector change. We need to shift our day to day practices to center community as a sort of everyday dismantling. Next, I'll highlight some examples from other nonprofits so you can see how they've put CCF principles into action specifically for donor cultivation purposes. And since we have limited time, we'll look closely at three principles, number 3, 6, and 7. So there's typically been a lot of fear and perceived risk around organizations being mutually supportive of one another. Um, an example, I think a really easy and beautiful example of organizations supporting one another is one I saw from a youth arts organization. Um, they were requesting donations or in-kind donations for themselves and for a partner organization via like an Amazon wish list. Um, they said something like, please purchase art supplies for our youth artists using our Amazon wish list. And a number of our youth artists are food insecure. We partner with or admire the work of this other organization that ensures that every student has access to an after school snack. So, in addition to sending art supplies to us, we encourage you to send monetary gifts or non perishable food items to them. I thought that was just such a lovely and easy example of a way to show your donors that your community needs more than just your nonprofit, that your community is grappling with a larger set of needs. That, going back to that example earlier about how one person um, becomes involved with numerous nonprofits, it goes back to that idea. This arts organization isn't filling any and all gaps in community. They have a very specific focus, and they're seeing that a large number of their clients are facing these other sorts of hardships. Let's talk to donors about that. Let's create this cultivation experience for this other organization because we know our donors, they don't just care about the art in this example, they care about the youth. And if they truly care about the youth, they'll also want to support all the other needs that young people have, and that being, needing access to food. So I thought this was just a very simple way to start sharing donor audiences with one another. You could do the same for organizations that have very similar focus areas. Of going back to that example I had about the transgender organization. They focused on adults. They knew a partner that focused on youth, and they wanted to be sure that the funder knew about it. They said, we fill this gap. This other organization has this skill set. Combined, our forces are needed in community to do good. Please, please support both of us. Um, there's other ways that you can do this. I've seen it done in email appeals. Giving Tuesday has just happened on days like Give Big. If you're in the Seattle area, there's opportunities to say, hey, thank you so much for giving to us. We really appreciate you considering a donation to our organization today. We're a proud collaborator with these other organizations. If you'd like to check them out, if you have the ability to make an additional donation, please click here to learn more about their work. So there's also this example shows that there's this opportunity to help donors, to help with donor cultivation for other organizations. I've also seen it happen at events where it might be two organizations coming to support one another at an event. It might be an executive director of one organization presenting a speaker at another organization's event. There's all sorts of ways to be mutually supportive of one another, and it's going to show your donors that you're not a monolith. It's going to show your donors that there's these other bubbles of need that overlap and intersect with your work, and that there's other ways to get involved. And that in turn is going to increase donor cultivation for those other efforts and for those other missions. So, looking closely at Principle 6, Some examples from Principle 6, which is we treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent and occasionally have difficult conversations. Um, as I shared before, I used to work at a nonprofit focused on parks and public space, and we had some supporters who seemed only interested in giving to their neighborhood rose garden historically. Um, Through a communication series, we slowly started to talk to them about equity through their interests being the rose gardens. So by saying things like, have you noticed that not all Seattle neighborhoods have beautiful rose gardens? Like, let's talk about why that is. Or, hey, you recently shared a story with me where you said that you feel like your life is enriched by having access to this beautiful garden within walking distance of your home. You told me how it was great for your mental health, for your physical health, how it's a great place for your kids to play or, to take walks with your parents there. Do you think others should have access to gardens like that? And the immediate response was, well, yes, of course. Like, don't they? And it opened the door then to have some difficult conversations with people, um, and exploring why some neighborhoods have rose gardens and others don't. We started hosting some tours to understand and to see how redlining has shaped Seattle neighborhoods. We had some folks from the city, some folks from a local history museum come in to share their historical perspective and to provide um, some facts and party content of, we're not making this up. Like, this is in the history books. Like, let's talk about it. And it provided the context and illustrated that there are inequitable parks in the Seattle area. And honestly, some people did feel uncomfortable by this truth, and they either weren't ready or open to receive it. But nonetheless, we were transparent about our funding priorities and were open to dialogue. Um, while some supporters left, the authenticity and transparency was recognized and reciprocated by others. Uh, some supporters doubled their donations, and it created an opportunity for a brand new crowd to get involved with the foundation. Um, it's really hard and scary to let go of donors, especially when they've been giving annually for a consistent basis. But if your organization is evolving and your donor base isn't, it's probably going to get a bit sticky. And that was the case at this organization where um, it made a really intentional decision to focus on equity in parks and public spaces, and to enter neighborhoods that historically did not have a, that organization's presence in them. And it just opened the doors for these really lovely, challenging, sometimes awkward conversations to talk about those root causes again. Um, And while some donors, like I said, were turned off, we were then able to reach this entirely new pool of donors. We were able to cultivate donors through this education and stewardship theories of, let's start with email messaging that very clearly shares our new priorities and why we have these new priorities focused on equitable parks and spaces. Why is equity important to this subject? How has it not shown up in this space before? And then we were able to continue donors and prospective donors down this communication series pathway of saying, come to this event. It's going to be in the Georgetown and South Park neighborhood. Some donors came and they said, I've never come over here before. I had no idea this was part of Seattle, or I had no idea that they didn't have lovely rose gardens in the same way that my neighborhood does. So it just created this opportunity to have the donor education, but to also create this cultivation through shared values. It was not at all transactional. It was truly based on, do you have these same values? Do you want what you have? Do you want other people to have that? And then how can we work together to just make sure that we're all working towards this collective community? Because I know that my family is thriving in our daily walks through our rose garden. How can I create this opportunity or help contribute to this opportunity for other families? Let's also look at principle number 7. They foster a sense of belonging, not othering. Um, I've seen nonprofits ensure that their photos and stories represent the actual demographic breakdown of the clients they serve. For instance, a university may have prospective student brochures covered in Black and brown faces, but in actuality, the student population is only 20% people of color. If that's the case, 90% of the brochure shouldn't depict students of color. Um, I've also seen nonprofits ensure that client stories are told in the client's native language, letting an English translation come second. Um, this also helps to make sure that client stories aren't extractive. When I think about fostering a sense of belonging, I also like to think about what are all of the ways people might find our organization. Um, with clients, I do an activity called community mapping, and it's really thinking about your organization at the core. What are all the reasons that people may get involved? I can use examples from the Seattle Parks Foundation. Um, and, there were some people, like I said, just in it for the rose gardens. Um, so there were folks that just loved the parks that they had access to, and that's what they wanted to support. And maybe had not yet put a lot of thought into inequitable parks and public spaces in surrounding neighborhoods, but they loved what they had access to. Um, Next were young families, people that were in it for the playgrounds. They wanted to make sure their kids had accessible, um, safe places to play. Another category was racial equity. There were some folks that were very focused on um, creating equitable parks and public space systems. They did want to talk about that history of gentrification and displacement. Um, and then on the other side, there was also a climate justice and conservation component. There were folks that wanted to make sure that the river is no longer polluted, that the salmon return to the creeks, and that's why they were in it. And to remember that there was a very different and various ways that people were coming to our organization really helped create that sense of belonging. It was an opportunity in our fundraising and communications to say, hey, we see all of you. You all are here. Um, Maybe at first for different reasons, but you see our mission, you see that it's contributing to good in your neighborhood, and you want to be a part of that. So we appreciate that. We welcome you to this space. We want to hear from you. We want to know what's going on in your neighborhoods. And I think that really helped to create that sense of belonging where different community leaders or donors and staff and neighbors were able to come together and say, oh, my personal priority is A, and I know that yours is B, but overall, we see that. We see a solution as a thriving neighborhood parks and public space system. So I think in identifying how to foster a sense of belonging and understanding just who are all the different players in your organization, in your neighborhood, in your mission focus area, if it's not something defined by geographic terms, who are all of those different bubbles of people that can then overlap, intersect, and engage with one another. And that's really going to help foster that sense of belonging. From a fundraising perspective, it's really helpful when you can do that over all different donor groups. It's not just something for major donors to participate in. It's not just the work for $1 donors to do. How can you really create that sense of community where everyone is proud of the contribution they make, be it monetary, time, expertise, or maybe something else? So, as we start wrapping up our exploration of the 10 principles of CCF, along with some examples of how other organizations are actualizing it, I really want to encourage you to do some self reflection. Just due to our format today, we're not able to have a discussion or breakout rooms, and I find that there's such interesting perspectives and ways that folks are either aligned or not yet aligned with CCF. So I really encourage you, if you have time, maybe pause this presentation for 5 minutes and really consider these questions of, does community-centric fundraising resonate with you? Which principles stand out to you the most and why? And which principles feel needed, easy to actualize, challenging, risky? Are there principles that you want to take back to your team? Do you already have an idea of what actualizing them would look like, or is that up for more discussion and more brainstorming? It's always interesting to see what folks are thinking at this point. Maybe you're already actualizing them. Maybe you've made a deliberate decision not to. And again, it really is that spectrum of what is right for your organization in this moment, depending on your mission, depending on your financial stability, depending on where the organization is in a collective equity journey. That plays a huge factor into how community centric fundraising can be implemented. I can share another example of an organization that I was supporting, and that organization was focused on healthcare, and they were doing a similar exercise to this. And they said, hey, internally, we understand what CCF is. We support it. Externally, we're not ready to have these sorts of challenging conversations with donors. We don't want to turn them off. Um, so it was just very fascinating that internally they said, "Oh, we totally acknowledge how the medical system has some racist roots to it. We acknowledge that there's discrepancies between the way people of different races are treated in the medical profession, and that is a conversation that we have internally with staff, with the board, with our medical providers, and even with our clients. But we're not quite ready to have it with our donors. We're not sure how that would go over, and right now we really need to focus on getting things funded so we could pursue what we need to and what our community needs. But right now it feels really risky to start having those identical conversations with donors. Um, I've also met organizations that say the opposite of, we can't wait any longer. We can't put staff in situations that might be problematic or harmful for the community that they're representing. If donors are not aligned, we need to let them go. And in that case, that other organization was willing to take what they perceived as a financial risk, but really something that they needed to do for the wellness of their staff. Too many of their staff were being put in positions of defending the organization and defending the community. And they decided that they were no longer willing to engage in such discussions. So CCF it looks different to different organizations. It looks different to different geographies, different missions, but all in all, I'd love for you to do some self-reflection right now of what's standing out to you, and how come. And before we end, I wanted to share one of the very first tools that we put on the community-centric fundraising website, and this is our CCF aligned action list. You can find it under resources on the community-centric fundraising website. And this was really an initial spreadsheet to help get people thinking about the different ways that they can implement CCF into their organizations. It's a 4-page spreadsheet. I wanted to walk you through some of it now because in many cases, people are doing things that are CCF aligned, but maybe just haven't termed it that way. If you're doing anything to uplift community voices, to help break out maybe the historical hierarchy that's been formed within an organization, its donors, its clients, its community. You're doing some CCF work. So this spreadsheet is a great way to just walk you through that of, is your fundraising grounded in race, equity, and social justice? Here's some examples we've come up with of things that you could do. Maybe you're already doing them, you could note them here. If not, maybe it's something to take back to your organization and consider. This also goes into this title at the bottom. Are you investing in BIPOC staff and staff from marginalized communities? The heart of this really is your staff representative of the community that you serve? Fundraising has historically been a very white dominated female role that people have. But as we're shifting to more community driven organizations, how can we make sure that we're also adjusting our internal culture or internal opportunities for more diverse staff to be a part of those missions as well? Other opportunities here is, like we talked about, support other organizations and nonprofits. How does your organization show up in community? Do you volunteer at other nonprofits' events? Do you introduce other nonprofits to your existing donors? Um, do you decline funding if your organization can afford to? We've seen that a lot where, somebody might discover the secret sauce to a fundraising appeal or a grant that they find, and they might say, "Oh my goodness, this works so well for us. We can't tell anyone. We don't want them to take these resources from us." And that's really illustrative of that scarcity mindset. So instead of thinking that way, how could we have more of an abundance mindset of, wow, this strategy really worked well for us. Now let's share it with some other organizations. We want them to thrive too. We know that our donors are generous. We know that our donors understand the importance of having multiple nonprofits support a community. We don't have that fear that if a donor knows about another nonprofit, that they're going to abandon us. So let's share that secret sauce with other organizations. If we hear about a grant that we haven't applied to before, maybe it doesn't exactly align with us, let's share it with some colleagues rather than hoard it and say, "Oh, wow, this grant looks amazing. It's for the next county over. Let's create a new program in that county so we qualify for this grant." So many organizations do that. So instead, say, "Wow, this seems like a wonderful opportunity. I want to share it with this other organization, make sure that they know about it." And something amazing that I've been seeing lately are well-resourced organizations sharing their capacity with smaller organizations. I just heard of one saying, "Hey, we have a lot of staff power. We have some grant writers. It's a slow season for us. We've had all these other amazing opportunities come up. We're actually lending our grant writing support to these smaller organizations that make a big difference in community." Another category that we have already discussed today is recognize donors of time and talent, not just donors of cash. Um, I think so often in fundraising, we're taught to write handwritten thank you notes. And personally, I'm not against them. I like to think about, how can we uplift all of the other groups that make up a nonprofit in the same way that we do donors? So, when's the last time you wrote a handwritten thank you note to a volunteer or a coworker or a board member? And thinking about capacity that way. If you only have time to write 10 handwritten notes a month, maybe they all shouldn't go to donors. Other categories on this CCF aligned action sheet: an audit for poverty tourism. That's really at the heart of that is really those extractive stories. How are we bringing people in just so they feel like the hero? We don't want them to gawk at community members and clients. We don't want to have that charity. that sense of pity towards others. So if we're doing that, what are other ways that we can steward and engage donors that, don't take somebody else's hardships into account? Another is ensuring that your communications and events are accessible, um, using big fonts, um, being able to have live captioning at events. Those are all huge. Thinking about the ways that you're engaging with donors. If it's only digital, are there other opportunities? Are there opportunities for phone calls? Are there opportunities for in person? How can people best engage with your content in a variety of ways? And then have challenging conversations with donors. We've talked about this one a lot. Um, if you are dealing with high wealth donors, it's always encouraged to help folks think about where their wealth came from. There are some organizations, I'm thinking of Liberated Capital, which is part of Decolonizing Wealth, that's all about talking to donors about their wealth. Where is the origins of their wealth? Um, how was that wealth accumulated? What communities were at a disadvantage because they were taken advantage of? And is there a opportunity for reparations or to invest in those communities? And then end transactional practices. That's really going into that heroism approach of, every 95 cents goes to programs. It goes back to that being transparent about overhead costs. Um, there's ways to publicly thank donors and funders that show that there's other moving pieces. So instead of saying, without your support, we couldn't do this, or you are directly sponsoring this event, you can say something like, your donation, your sponsorship, um, combined with the volunteer hours, the staff power, and the expertise of the board, have helped us do X, Y, and Z, really showing that it takes the collective community to be able to make things happen. It's not just one person's check. And then support transformative work. How are we leading in what we do to have those policy changes? Like I said, with the food bank example, what are we doing to end hunger and not just put a band aid on the symptoms that are happening right now? What are ways that we can create an advocacy plan? How can we speak out? How can we uplift the voices of marginalized people without just speaking for them? So, this is really just a starting point of all the different ways that you can think about CCF. I really love this document because I think it shows how this doesn't just live within a fundraising team. It's really for the full organization. I also like to think of CCF as a step in an organization's equity journey. If your organization does have a deliberate equity journey that they're doing, from what I've witnessed, it's really easy for folks to start learning that. And apply it to programs. But I think fundraising really has been forgotten. So there's tons of equity work you can do in fundraising. And I think CCF is a natural step towards that. So we're at time. Thank you so much for joining this session and for considering how community-centric fundraising may play a role in your fundraising efforts. If you're looking for more resources and would like to get involved, you can find us at community-centricfundraising.org. There, you'll have access to the CCF Slack community. That's where we have 7,000 people answering questions, helping one another out, providing examples of what they've been working on that's CCF aligned. There's also the Content Hub, which is a weekly blog. Every week, there's new articles about various different ways folks have experienced CCF, learned from it, failed at CCF, all sorts of great content there. Um, And you can also learn more about these principles if you want to revisit them on the website. You can also follow Vule's blog at Nonprofit AF, and Michelle Murray has a wonderful podcast exploring CCF aligned topics called The Ethical Rainmaker. Thank you so much. I'd love to connect. You can connect with me via email and LinkedIn. My email is Andrea at andrea-arenas.com. Best of luck in your fundraising efforts, and thank you for all you do in community. Bye.